The sounds of movement and branches breaking on the left side of the tent, over to the back side of the tent, and then back to the left side of the tent, and again to the back of the tent. Then the sound would stop and the forest was dead silent. And this continued for hours. The only difference from last night is that whatever was in the woods is getting closer and closer to his camp this time. Bolder and bolder. Louder and louder. Joe's fear took over and he did the only thing he could think of. He took shelter inside his tent in an effort to get away and ease his mind and separate himself from whatever it is outside, even though the tent isn't much separation at all. Joe would occasionally come out of his tent to add a log to the fire and then go right back in. But he noticed something. When he would go into his tent, he could hear whatever it was in the woods getting closer and closer to his camp. And then when he'd come out, it would back off until he went back into his tent. And then it would come closer and closer. Suddenly, he uncontrollably screamed out into the night as he heard the sounds of the breaking branches and heavy footsteps approaching his tent. "Hey bear, hey bear, hey bear!" Silence. All he could think to do now is to keep the fire burning so he could see and attempt to make it through the night. As he went back into his tent, suddenly he noticed the rocks hitting his tent once again, one by one. Plink, plink. Something was tossing rocks again at his tent, and there was no wind to blow pine cones anywhere, so he knew what was happening. At this point, Joe started to figure out how he could get out of the woods. But it's the middle of the night. There is no way out. No roads nearby. He's deep in the back country, and it took him a 4-hour paddle through tough terrain just to get out here. Taking that trip now in the middle of the night would be a nightmare. Of course. At this point, which nightmare is worse? His only option was to wait it out until the morning. Though as the sounds continue getting bigger and bigger, closer and closer, the morning may never come. It was after 3 a.m. now as Joe sat inside his tent, scared, trembling, unsure of the unknown in the woods. The sounds aren't going away. The tree knocks, the branches breaking, something large pacing in the woods only 20 or 30 feet from his tent, buried in the thick brush. Whatever it was wanted him to know it was there. More tiny rocks continued to hit Joe's tent, and in a fed-up, fear-driven panic, he started yelling at whoever or whatever it was outside his tent. "Leave me alone! Go away!" This is where all hell broke loose. Suddenly, he was hit with a roar, a scream, so loud and so powerful he could feel it in his chest. A single scream that lasted at least 15 seconds with one breath of air. The sound was so terrible as it started out guttural like a lion's roar, and ended high and even louder like that of a woman's scream. A sound so powerful and so big that nothing can quite describe it. An awful sound. Whatever it was in the woods was screaming at him over and over again. This was no bear. Now completely frozen with fear and terrified beyond understanding, Joe couldn't move from his tent. His limbs wouldn't budge. He had never experienced so much fear in his life. Joe had no way to defend himself, whether he was in his tent or out. His only defense was hoping that this thing, this animal, this creature goes away on its own. The screaming continued, like a lion's roar that never stops or lets up as Joe trembled in his tent, his eyes closed, completely frozen. The branches in the woods now continued to break everywhere from every side of his tent. The movement and pacing was fast and big, moving from the back of his tent to the side of his tent and breaking everything in its path, like a freight train moving through the woods with no regard. It was just outside his campsite now, along the tree line as the sounds came from directly outside the tent. And suddenly, the screaming stopped. And Joe sat motionless in his one-man tent. The screaming halted. After 10 minutes of silence, Joe muscled up the courage to step out of his tent. Slowly. Upon leaving his tent, suddenly a basketball-sized boulder came flying from the tree line directly behind his tent and landed a foot away from Joe and his fire. It was at this moment Joe looked into the woods and saw a set of glowing red eyes staring at him through the brush. Paralyzed with fear, Joe couldn't move, and he couldn't look away. He stared at the glowing eyes as they stared right back at him. They were as bright as two lights, so bright no eye shine from the flames could ever compare. And knowing the power that it took to throw a rock of this magnitude, Joe knew there was nothing he could do if this thing wanted to get him. He stood there with his eyes closed. Nothing he could do now as it let out another roar. And then, the sounds of the pre-dawn loons started to cry to the west in the distance. Daybreak must be coming soon. The sun was coming, and in an instant, the loon cried for the second time, and the red eyes were gone. The woods went quiet. The screaming stopped. Joe worked up the courage to jump inside his tent where he sat trembling and praying for daylight. And the loons continued to cry, and within 30 minutes, first light had arrived. Daylight was coming. Joe remained in his tent for another hour after the silence began, waiting to hear more sounds in the woods, but hoping that they were finished like they did the night before. It was now after 6 a.m. as Joe slowly came out of his tent and cautiously walked around the campsite. His fire was nothing but ashes at this point as the basketball-sized boulder sat 12 inches to the right. I am not staying another night. I am out of here, Joe thought to himself as he quickly began to pack up his tent and his gear. He brought everything down to his kayak at the river, and then he noticed a giant footprint in the mud, perfectly indented. A print that was not next to his boat on the river's edge last night. It was the shape of a human's foot with toes, yet the big toe was multiple inches longer than the rest. The print was huge and measured 20 inches. It was time to leave, and it was time to leave right now. Joe told himself, I don't know, maybe this is a bear print, though he knew that something more lurks in these woods, and something more than a bear was in his campsite last night, and just moments earlier. What frightened Joe the most was the fact that all of the noise from the night came from the opposite side of his tent, nowhere near the kayak or the river along his campsite. Was this thing walking around his campsite a mere feet away from his tent? Was there more than one of these things in the woods last night? The sounds and screams came from the other side of the camp, and yet the footprint is over here. So many questions arose in his mind as the fear continued to fill his body, and he quickly threw his gear in the boat, leaving some of it behind. The trip was being cut short, and he wasn't staying another minute out here. He began paddling back on the Sacandaga River, back through the slight rapids and the calm stretches, past the beaver dams and the rocky carries. It was a quiet paddle, somber even, looking at the shoreline, jumping at every small sound or movement from the shore as the sun continued to rise, cautiously moving through the Adirondack wilderness that he spent his whole life wandering. Yet something was now different about this rugged land. We may never know what exactly Joe encountered those June nights along the Sacandaga River, lurking deep in the remote parts of the Adirondack Park, the branches breaking, the powerful tree knocking, the screaming, the glowing red eyes in the darkness. But what we do know is he'll never go back, and he'll never go camping alone again. Well, I hope you enjoyed this special edition of the 46 of 46 podcast, Campfire Stories. Remember to always leave no trace, do the rock walk, and if you carry it in, carry it out. See you on the trails.